Hey, Bill Persinger, this is Stephen Owens. Before we get started, did you get that email I sent out on Friday?
I did, Chairman, and I need to take a look at that. I took off part of Friday and got a few I need to breeze through. I'll get to that pretty quick.
No problem. You know, that happens when we take a little bit of time off. So take your time. Thank you.
Yeah. It was a working day off. If that makes any sense.
I know full well how that works.
Yeah, I'll bet
completely.
You do. I'll bet you do.
Let's try that again. It's 1:31. Can people hear me? Okay, getting the high sign. I can't see everybody who's on, but I think the way we're supposed to start these things off with is start this off with a recitation about the coma situation. So Natalie, if you're on, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Natalie Scott with the Office of Reviser of Statutes. Due to health and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication, allowing members of the public without cost to listen to the meeting through the use of live stream audio broadcasting on the internet and teleconference as available. Information on how to access this meeting was sent out with the notice for this meeting. The agenda for this meeting was included with the notice of the meeting. It may also be requested from the Office of Reviser of Statutes using the Office of Reviser of Statutes official website at ks.reviser.org. Any other documents presented during this meeting will also be available from the Office of Reviser of Statutes. Each member of the commission and staff will state their name and title each time the individual begins speaking or voting so that the individual can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones, phones, or other electronic devices are muted when the participants are not speaking so that the ability of remote listeners and observers to hear the proceedings is not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be taken at this meeting. During this commission meeting, the commission will not recess into closed or executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319. And each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee, and the chairperson will announce the votes of each motion. And if there are no questions, that's all I have. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Natalie. I was trying to unmute myself there. All right, a couple other things, sort of housekeeping. Number one, we don't have minutes to approve from our last meeting, but Jordan tells me we'll have last month's and then likely this minutes from today's meeting to be approved at the next session. So no approval of minutes is necessary today. Also, I was going to let folks know as we get started here, just as a housekeeping matter, that we have been approved for, I guess it's 16 more meetings at this point to be divided up among the commission and the various subcommittees. So we can get some details out about that, what that looks like for everybody. But that was one of the concerns we had, is that with the new calendar, with the new fiscal year for the state, we needed to have approval for additional meetings, and we received that late last week, I believe. So I think the next thing to do, pardon me, is do a roll call, and so the listeners can know who's here, and then we'll start on with the agenda. So for the call to order, we'll ask Mark Bennett, Chairman, is speaking right now, and we'll go down let's see here. I thought I had it in front of me. Natalie, I apologize. Would you happen to have the list of people to call to roll, if you wouldn't mind?
Mr. Chairman, I actually don't have that in front of me either, but I can get it here really quickly, and Jordan can jump on if he has it in front of him.
Mr. Chairperson, I've got it. I can go ahead and start if that's okay.
Thank you. I apologize. Thought I had it in front of me.
Not a problem. So we've got Mark Bennett, Chair, Representative Owens,
Representative Owens is present.
Senator Haley, Senator Wilborn, Representative Finney,
Representative Finney present.
Chief Todd Ackerman,
Present.
Jennifer Basinger. I believe she said she'd be absent today.
Correct.
Judge Brown,
Present.
Sheriff Carr,
Sheriff Carr present.
Judge Clark, I believe I see him on. Judge Clark, are you here? I see him on the call. Is Professor Francis here?
John Francis is here.
Spence Keene,
Present.
Tabitha Owen,
Present.
Sylvia Penner, Bill Persinger,
Present.
Professor Phillips,
Present.
Pastor Robertson, Shelley Williams,
Present.
Reggie Robinson, I believe I saw Jessica Domi for General Schmidt.
I believe the Attorney General was going to call in.
I'm here.
Thank you. Director Schultz,
Present.
Secretary Zmuda,
Randy Bowman sitting in for the secretary.
and then for staff, I see Connie Bonner is on the call. Bob Gallimore,
I'm here.
myself, Malaysia Shagun,
Present.
Jenna Moyer, Natalie Scott, we've heard from her, and Jason Thompson.
Present.
And then I believe we have Patrick Armstrong from CSG.
Present.
And I thought I saw Greg Halls on earlier as well. Is there anyone else present on the call that I have not read off?
This is Rachel Druckhammer. I'm here. I'm also with CSG.
Thank you, Rachel. Is there anyone else? Okay, I believe that that finishes roll.
Okay, very good. Before we get on to the Council for State Governments presentation, Jordan reminded me that I need to let Mr. Schultz or Sentencing Commission folks know, I think Ms. Silvati has been, is no longer on the commission. And I think she was an appointee from Sentencing Commission. So we need to probably get somebody to replace her. That have to happen obviously today, but get a name circulated so we can add her position back onto the commission.
Yeah, this is Scott. We actually have, that's all already in process, and we do have about 3 candidates right now, and that'll work through the process hopefully by end of the month, and we'll have somebody to be able to get on this commission.
Very good. Just one last matter of bookkeeping. So with that, the next item on the agenda for today is a presentation from the Council of State Governments, CSG. I think Patrick Armstrong, I'll turn it over to him momentarily, but they have been in the state of Kansas working with some of the stakeholders and have a update that they presented to us earlier during the term of the commission. and have information to share with us. And then we've discussed the fact that we'll afford them some time again, at least twice yet. Probably, I think we decided October, and then likely November, maybe as early as I'll turn over. I'll let Patrick tell us the dates exactly, but I wanted to make sure that they had adequate time to talk to us before we try to put the finishing touches on what at this point is the final product, the final report from the commission, with the caveat, in case anyone's wondering, yes, we are going to ask the legislature to extend the life of this commission, given the situation with COVID and what it did to our legislative package this last year, and how difficult it's been to conduct business remotely. But we still do need to comply with our statutory mandate to have a report issued by December. And so to that end, I will turn it over to Patrick, and he can give his presentation. Last thing I'd say is I think a synopsis of that was submitted, and I would be available. So, Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Bennett. And thanks to Vice Chair Owens and the rest of the commission members for giving us a chance to speak with you all today, and obviously work and participate on the ongoing subcommittee conversations that you've been having. That's been helpful for our team. I'll try to keep this update brief because Chairman Bennett covered basically the summary of it. But as you all know, I'm Patrick Armstrong, and my colleagues Greg Halls and Rachel Druckhammer are on the phone. We're with the Council of State Governments. Thanks to Jordan for sharing the document that Chairman Bennett just referenced, which summarizes how we hope to work with you all in the coming weeks and months. And it's okay if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. I'm going to quickly walk through it, but this is really just to formally announce that we're finally able to officially work with the commission in an official capacity between now and December. That final report that Chairman Bennett just referenced, you'll recall possibly back in January when we presented in person with you all. Seems like it was so long ago now. But at that meeting, Chairman Bennett, General Schmidt, Secretary Zamuda, and the other state leaders submitted a letter to the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, to officially request some staff and research capacity for this commission. And given COVID and the delay with the legislature and them not reviewing your recommendations from last December, that obviously slowed down the work that you all have been doing, but it slowed down the approval process for us to officially ramp up as well. But thankfully, that's all been worked out. And what it really means is that our team will be able to dedicate work hours and research capacity to help as you all explore the various criminal justice system problems that you've been talking about for so long, and think about recommendations to include in your final report in December, in a few months here coming up. And the focus areas that we're going to be diving into mostly are mirrored around the conversations you all have been having in the subcommittees, but also in the subcommittee that you have formed. And there are 4 key areas that stand out, and I'll list them now. The first one being us working to help you all find ways to more effectively use correctional resources, including prison space. 2, strengthening community supervision to reduce violations and revocations. 3, working to address the behavioral health needs of people in the criminal justice system, and that's those with mental illness challenges as well as substance use challenges. And 4, improving reentry efforts in the state by focusing on providing employment and housing support for folks that are involved in the justice system, again, with the goal of helping them succeed when they're out and in the community, so they're not end up cycling back through the jails and the prison system. And so with those 4 key focus areas that we're going to be looking at, the approach that we're going to be taking is looking at really 3 distinct separate things, separate types of information we're going to be gathering. The first is going to be looking at case level prison and sentencing data that thankfully we've received from Secretary Zamuda and his staff, as well as Director Schultz and his staff at the Sentencing Commission. We'll take a look at laws and policies and how those play out in Kansas by talking to folks like you all, practitioners and stakeholders and your colleagues, and all that information we're going to be gathering. We'll be funneling that to the relevant subcommittees as we're learning of it and figuring things out so that you all can use it in your deliberations as you're considering ways to help the state move forward. And our next immediate steps will be connecting with all the subcommittee chairs from the 6 subcommittees that you all have. We've already reached out to everyone, and most, if not all of them, have responded back with times that they're available to speak in the next week or so. And we'll lay out for them our plan for the next several weeks and several months and give them a chance to react, respond, help guide, and structure that. And then we'll report that out to the subcommittees for, again, another opportunity to, when you all have your next subcommittee meetings, to provide feedback. And then from there, each month, our team will provide a update to the subcommittees on how those processes are going, the information we're gathering, so that you can help drive the conversation, take it into account as you're deliberating. And then, as Chairman Bennett mentioned, we're also going to do 2 presentations to this commission in this format, one in September, and the second one will be either in October or November, depending on how things shake out. But we want to make sure that you all have all the information that we have at our fingertips at your disposal going into that December final report that you will be producing. And so all that mostly is in the document that Jordan sent around. But happy to, we're going to elaborate on the next subcommittee meeting to the extent that folks have questions or need some clarification on what I just walked through. But also our email addresses are included in that document. So feel free to reach out to myself or Greg, and we're happy to respond via email, by phone, and talk through where we think they're headed, where we think things are headed, or respond to any questions that you might have. So with that, I'll take any questions now if there's any, and then otherwise turn it back to Chairman Bennett. Looking forward to speaking to you all on your subcommittees.
Thank you. Any questions for Patrick? I think that's enough time for people to get their mute button turned off. So I'm guessing no questions at this point, but appreciate your interest in our system and what we're doing here, and looking forward to the information you have to share with us in September. I misspoke earlier and I said October would be the 1st of September, and then either October or November. So, all right, very good. All right, well, if there's no questions for those folks, for Patrick or the others at CSG, we will then 3 minutes ahead of schedule move on to the subcommittees. So I think the first one, these aren't in any particular order, but just the way they're laid out: diversion, specialty courts, especially prisons, supervision subcommittee. I think, Spence, that would be you, Mr. Cohen.
Yes, hey, this is Spence Cohen. Thank you. So our subcommittee, our full subcommittee met on July 8th. And per our normal, or how I've been doing things so far, I'm going to go ahead and ask, since we have several work groups, obviously, per our name, that the head of each one of those groups kind of give a progress report of what we have going on at this time. I'll start off with talking about the diversion work group. As you all might remember, last time we were here, we had asked, we need a new chairperson for the diversion work group. And when we were here last time, I asked permission, or actually sought to see if anybody would be willing to step up and take that, the reins of that working group. Chairman Bennett did step up, and then he did join us for our meeting on the 8th, and he will be doing taking the lead on the diversion work group. I don't think, I know Tabitha Owen gave kind of a brief update to all of us of what's been going on with the diversion work group, or what had been going on. There hasn't been any progress made lately, but my feeling is that Chairman Bennett will get that started going, and obviously if you need anything from me, let me know. But I don't think there's anything else, and I could be wrong, correct me anybody if there's more to report on the diversion work group.
No, I believe the historical background that Tabitha gave had, obviously to do with the diversion bill that was proposed last year. We got it passed the House 125 to nothing, a very positive vote. We were set for a positive result in the Senate when the Legislature had to shut down. So I think that'll be top of the list for next year, or rather for the December 1, 2020 report. And then we'll talk about anything else we want to add to that agenda.
Thank you. For the specialty courts, I'll ask Judge Brown to give an update. He also, these are redundant to the supervision, but I know everybody else will be interested in what's going on. So Judge Brown.
Thank you. The work group is putting together some proposed legislation for specialty courts, and rough drafts are being prepared. We're hoping to have a finished product for review by the commission as a whole prior to our December final report, in hopes that we may be able to make a recommendation for the next legislative session. So that's where we're at, and I'm hopeful we'll have something to you in the not too distant future. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I believe I didn't speak to Mr. Bowman before this, but since he's here for Secretary Zamuda, he gave us a report at our committee. So I'm going to ask Randy if you do that again for this full commission.
Certainly, Spence. Randy Bowman, Kansas Department of Corrections for Secretary Zamuda. So what I shared with the group when we met last week actually changed late in the week, so I'll cover both. But there had been some discussion around the allotment process for fiscal year 20 and a list of items prepared by the governor and run by the Finance Council in the latter part of June that did strike the funding for the Lansing project that was the substance abuse and the Winfield project that was the older population for fiscal year 20. What I can add that wasn't part of my report last time is we did get our budget instructions last Friday afternoon, and the 21 money remains in our budget allocation amount, as does it was built into our 2022 allocation amount. So lots of decisions being made by lots of people in the coming months, but the appearances are right now that we should be able to go forward with those projects. Just had a few months delay in the process, probably over the summer as this got vetted out. With that, that's all I have today.
Anybody have any questions?
Just to clarify, I'm taking notes as you spoke, Randy, that the beds at Winfield and the beds at Lansing, is that correct?
Correct.
I guess just for the sake of clarity for people listening, very briefly, the beds at Winfield are distinct from the beds at Lansing in what respect? I know you've told us, but the public may not know this.
Sure. So the proposed project at Winfield is modifications to an existing building down there to have a set of beds. I want to recall about 250, but I didn't look that up today, for elderly folks to specifically meet their needs when they're in our care as per court orders. The Lansing project, a little over 200 beds, that would be on the old east unit of that facility, which would be a substance abuse specific program.
Thank you.
You bet, sir.
Nothing else from me.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. I'll ask Shelley Williams to report on the Supervision Work Group. Shelley?
Thank you, Spence. The Supervision Work Group has met 3 times since the Reform Commission had their meeting in June. With the expanded workshop, we've been able to get quite a bit done. We just sent out an employment and housing survey to the 3 supervision entities. That included the community corrections, court services, and parole. All of those directors went out on Friday. So we are still busy doing lots of data collection. We have a working draft timeline. We're working with Patrick and Greg of CSG. And we divided several policy issues, and especially ones that kind of revolve around violations and revocations. And hopefully we will have some recommendations at the end regarding those topics. So that is all I had. Thanks, Spence.
Sure. Anybody have questions for Ms. Williams? Great. So, Mr. Chairman, that's basically our report at this time. We do not have another meeting set, but we will probably do that about a week before this full commission meets again to be able to give another full report. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you. The next commission, or next subcommittee rather, is the Mental Health Substance Abuse Committee. I guess I should ask quickly, anybody have any questions for Spence regarding diversion, specialty courts, specialty prisons, and supervision subcommittee before we move on to the next subcommittee? Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to Mental Health Substance Abuse Subcommittee.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Mental Health Substance Abuse Committee has a meeting coming up next week. We're in the process of working with members from CSG to gather some information on them. We'll also be hearing from the assistant of Professor Francis. His assistant has prepared a presentation for us on this matter. In addition, we are in the process of recruiting members. Our committee is down to 4 voting members currently, and so we are in the process of looking for additional ex officio members that can join and add context and add input to our subcommittee meetings going forward. So in addition, I've reached out to Legislative Post Audit to get an update on that process and where that's at, and hope to have more to report at our next meeting.
All right, very good. Any questions for Representative Owens regarding Mental Health Substance Abuse Subcommittee? Seeing none, I'll turn it over to Chief Ackerman, the Proportionality Sentencing Subcommittee.
Thank you, Chief Ackerman here. We've had 2 meetings, one June 9th, where we went over and our long-term goals plus our short-term goals, what got cut short because of the legislative season this year, and what the Sentencing Commission still felt relevant for us to push in for the final report here at the end of the year. And then today this morning we had a second meeting because we keep talking about the survey we'd like to get out about the sentencing guidelines and for the proportionality. And we are going to push it out here. I hope to have it out within 2 weeks. We know the questions we want to ask. For one, and I would think the judges, we have also judges will probably have the most weight on it because they deal with it on a day-to-day basis more than probably anybody else, the rest of the groups. Now the associations, the prosecuting attorneys, judges, Kansas chiefs, and sheriffs is who we're going to send them to. For one, his first question is, do you think we need to combine or restructure the sentencing guidelines? And no, well then they don't have to finish it. But if it's yes, then we've got a couple more questions. And before I go too far this, I want to thank Patrick Armstrong, him and their crew. They sent us out some great information about what other states are doing, and that's kind of where we're going from there. So thank you, Patrick, on that. Now on the questions, do we need to combine them? Well, there's several states that have only one sentencing grid for all their crimes. There's several of us that have 2 or more grids. And then there's some that don't use grids whatsoever, and they just use worksheets. What we'd like to ask is, what if we would take the top 10 of each grid, I'm talking about statutes, that create the most problems with proportionality, and then work those instead of actually trying to reconstruct the entire grids. Because it's not every crime is unproportional. I mean, there's going to be your main ones every time. So I think that's what we're looking more toward focusing on, is fixing the top 10 of each one to start there. But what's kind of why we're here today, what do you guys think of that? You know, of doing that instead of looking at restructuring the entire thing?
From my perspective, I would say that makes it, because not to call it low-hanging fruit, but because we've already kind of overused that term, but the notion of coming back in the next session, 2021, and asking the legislature to completely overturn the existing sentencing guidelines and come up with something entirely new, whether it's putting drug grid and non-drug grid together, or scrapping grids altogether in favor of worksheets, like some I think the feds do a combination of both. If we were to do that, that would be fine, but that would be a monumental lift, not just a heavy lift. And on the heels of a year when the legislature got almost nothing done because was taken out of their hands by COVID, they're going to come back with a ton of work to get done to essentially catch up a year off. And asking them to take this on, I just think it would be, that may be an ultimate goal, a long-term goal that we can put in terms of either this final report, or if they give us another year, maybe make it more of a long-term goal for the December 2021 report. But to completely undo things, I just think we got to be realistic here. I don't think the legislature is going to have the time to take on something that monumental, whereas I think they could do some substantive good for a whole lot of folks by identifying 10 drug grid, 10 non-drug grid, or top 15, 20, whatever it comes up with, of types of crimes that need to be reassessed in terms of their punishment to make them more proportional. So that's my 2 cents worth. The last thing I'd say is it probably would be also appropriate to reach out to bids as well, because while the public defender system is not statewide in terms of it being in every judicial district, there are public defenders in many areas, and hearing what their perspective would be in Garden City, Junction City, Salina, Wichita, Johnson County, et cetera, might be useful as well, just for one more perspective on this subject. So
I would agree with you. I think that we ought to do is 10 enough, or should we, for the final report, ask for 15, whatever. But I think that's much more, like you say, negotiable for the next year, to easier for this to do with the time restraints we're going to be looking at, because I can't imagine how overloaded the legislature is going to be this next spring.
Sometimes you got to be pragmatic.
Oh yeah, I would agree. And
If I might,
I know I was asked about a question for proportionality, and I know it happens quite a bit, is downward departures. Not being an attorney, I don't know how much leeway there is for downward departures for judges to do that. As I'm told, it happens more than it should, and that's what creates a lot of the problem. But is it something we even want to look at or open that bear?
Well, I'll be deferential to Judge Brown here on his perspective, but I would say if you find a type of case that is habitually departures downward to probation are granted, then it might be reflective of the fact that that's a type of a case, or a type of a crime rather, that judges routinely think is disproportionately, would disproportionately require prison. It is a heavy lift for a judge to do that technically under the law. You're supposed to have certain findings they have to make that are not supposed to be the norm. But if it's happening across the board, that's one thing. But if it's happening habitually in one or two types of cases, maybe that speaks more to the presumptive sentence for that type of a crime than anything else. Just my 2 cents.
And maybe that'd be a much longer term something to have research more than we got time for this report.
Could be.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, this is Scott.
Go ahead, Scott.
What I can tell you is we do keep track of departures and departure reasons, and so that's all in our annual report, and so we track that every single year as to what is being used for departure reasons, upward as well as downward. Keep in mind that a lot of the downward departures you see are actually by agreement of the parties. So that is, and normally the judge will, because the parties have come to an agreement, will go along with that agreement. Not all the time, but and they certainly don't have to. But that's what we see a lot in terms of what the data tells us, that's actually being done by plea. Drug crimes are one of those that many times those level 1s and level 2 upper drug crimes are actually getting quite a few departures. In fact, a lot of the terms as far as the duration of those departures are actually off the grid to the right because they're lesser terms when they plead to them. So that's something that we have that data and could be provided.
Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, this is Sheriff Carr. This go to Scott. So Scott, if I understand you correctly, so you track all durational and dispositional departures?
Yeah, if they've been included in the journal entry that they have been a departure, we actually will track that and the reason for it.
Okay. Todd, I think that would be good in some of your studies, your data on your top 10 or top 15 as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's something I think we can do over for the report as well.
And Representative Owens, if I might just jump back, as it relates to the legislative session coming up, there's no doubt that we're gonna have our hands full with an awful lot of work. The thing to remember, though, is that anything introduced this coming session is good for the following session as well. And sometimes what we'll see are those big heavy lifts like we were talking about be introduced and then assign some kind of an interim study committee to work on it in the off season to make preparations for the following legislative session. So it's just something to consider, recognizing that we have 2 years once something is introduced, if it's introduced this year.
The kind of the way I was looking at it, Mr. Representative Owens, was our short-term goals didn't change, and that's what's going to be for this report, our short-term for here for 2020. But then take on for the long-term was the sentencing proportionality. So it give us a whole nother year yet to work on that as well. It's just, I know you guys are going to be way too bogged down, and it gives us a lot more leeway of time restraints as well. So that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for the proportionality sentencing subcommittee or Chief Ackerman?
Yeah, Mr. Chair?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Haley.
This is Haley. This is, and I certainly am pleased to hear this part. I want to echo a little bit of what Representative Owens just said, and encouraging Chief Ackerman at least to put something out. It's not the low-hanging fruit, if you will, Mr. Chair, but I mean, when we look at the truth in sentencing crowd, or the chorus that we're going to get for those who certainly don't want to see us roll back some of the sentences we've had, and also those that'll look to, should we pass this, retroactivity and other issues. There's no time really like the present to address at least where we are for proportionality. I look at, and another resource we might consider is at Department of Corrections with the Adult Offender Interstate Compact, a gentleman named Matt Billinger. And he studies where we are. We've been looking very closely at those who drive through our state and who are popped for marijuana charge while they're driving through, and what kind of comedy that has as we look at ourselves in this region, what kind of respect we have for surrounding laws. And I would hope that that would be a leverage for what comes out of this subcommittee and that we propose when we look at what reforms we advance, that we have an opportunity to see where reforms are inequitable, if you will, or where there's something missing when we in Kansas are the bottom, if you will, for what would be paritable or comparative, if you will, crimes, especially those possession crimes in other parts of this region. So I didn't want to take too much time. This is a very provocative, ongoing concern, certainly of mine. And I just want to encourage Chief Ackerman and for that subcommittee to make that a part of our report right now, because as Representative Owens says, we've got 2 years to give a pushback and bring about some reforms here, if in fact we do study them.
Senator Haley, I would agree with you on that, and I'm glad we have 2 years because it's going to take some time to get it all. If we're going to do it, we'll do it right. And for what you just told me, the concerns you have, would you email them to me for my next committee meeting and make sure we'll address those and see what we can do as a part of the either short or long-term report?
I will. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yep. Anyone else have a question for Chief Ackerman or this subcommittee? All right, I'll move on to data management. Ms. Basinger let me know that she was indisposed today, but consistent with her reports the last several times, that subcommittee is waiting on the post audit to try to identify what data management systems are available across the board in Kansas in terms of law enforcement agencies, whether state or more local. And so until that comes in, her subcommittee rather, doesn't have additional information yet. So let's see here then. So reentry subcommittee.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jean Phillips with KU. We had a meeting on June 17th, 2020. And then we had a subsequent working group meeting. So for the subcommittee meeting, we still talked about wanting to reintroduce those bills that dealt with driver's license issues, that you would not lose your license simply for not being able to pay a fine. We know that there was a Senate bill that was introduced, and we're going to try to work on merging those with the House bill and get those reintroduced. We also picked up on some new things that we wanted to work on. We talked about the ability or the impact that debt and detainers can have on individuals when they are released, and how collections, when they get turned over to collections, that can result in individuals' fines and fees becoming so high that they can't really get them paid off and moving forward. We had some folks who joined us on that committee meeting who asked us about how fines and fees worked. And one of the things we discovered is that we actually don't understand enough about the collections process. We know that each district can contract with their own agency, collection vendor for those collections, that the fees can range from 45% of the fines or fees to somewhat lower. I agreed to try to contact court administrators or district court trustees to sort of learn more about how that process works. Margie Phelps also joined us on that call. She works at DOC and discussed that, it's the driver's licenses and the child support issues that seem to impact people the most. We talked about ways that we could try to work with collections, and ultimately we decided that perhaps the best way to tackle that problem would be whether or not we could draft some legislation that would toll the collections, or turning people over to collections if they have been incarcerated, so that they don't sit and have amounts just accumulate over time while they're incarcerated. And so we're going to look at that. We also discussed, again, we've talked about this before, about collateral consequences. Margie Phelps provided us with a spreadsheet of the various statutes that impact ability of offenders to obtain licenses or jobs in various industries. Council of State Governments was in on that phone call, and they agreed to assist in this area of research. So I'm really glad to hear from Mr. Armstrong that we finally got approval to move forward. And so perhaps they can start helping us investigate those collateral consequences issues. Another issue that we took on is housing, and Representative Finney and I agreed to sort of develop this into its own working group along with Council of State Governments. So we discussed that part of the problem is that every local housing authority has their own rules and requirements, and for when offenders have access to those that housing ability, and when they're prohibited access. And so again, Margie Phelps, who has been very kind to our subcommittee, she works for DOC, and she explained the sort of hurdles that the various housing staff at DOC has to go through to try and persuade various local housing authorities to give offenders the ability to access housing there. And Patrick Armstrong, again with Council of State Governments, has agreed to assist us with trying to figure out how we can maybe provide better housing access to individuals once they are released. Finally, we talked about just sort of how to develop reentry programs and whether or not we could come up with programs. And what came out of that conversation, Secretary Zamuda and Margie Phelps again explained that it's not really an individual program per se, so much as it is trying to figure out what each individual offender needs, and that really at the center of that is employment, which is why we're going to try and look at those barriers to employment, whether it be licensing. For example, there are statutes that prohibit individuals from working where there is alcohol, which can impact a person's ability to work in a restaurant. So we're going to try and look at some of those statutes and see if we can't do something about that. And then, of course, the other part of those reentry programs is housing. And again, we're going to try and look at that. So I just want to also add that we had a follow-up working group with Representative Finney and myself. And on that call was Patrick Armstrong, Greg Halls, and Margie Phelps. And we discussed how we're going to try and tackle this housing and employment and sort of set in motion some plan for doing that. And that, there's the need for master leases, there's the need for housing specialists, there's perhaps a need for a forensic unit. One of the things that we've discovered is that there is difficulty finding housing for individuals who have special needs. And then we're going to look at challenges to jobs, again, especially with some of those licensing changes and those collateral consequences. And that's where we are. I've heard from Mr. Armstrong to try and set up a phone call next week, see if we can't move forward with some of that data collection.
Okay, very good. Sounds like you accomplished a lot. I guess I'll state the obvious, and just to say that the collateral consequences is probably the simplest in terms of what I'm about to say, but given the scope of this project, the more specific we can get, and I'm hoping Patrick and his outfit can help in this regard, but the more specific we can get with respect to proposed changes to existing law or standing up a new law that hasn't previously existed, the more specific we can get, the better. I think that will help the legislature in terms of, I mean, we're going to be fighting for their attention in the 2021 session, and the more fully realized we have a package to give them, change this bill in this way, maybe add this language to this bill. I think that the better equipped we're going to be. I think those collateral consequences are going to be fairly simple in terms of, here's the statute that says you can't be a hairdresser if you're, a felon. Strike that. And those will be, I think, easier to identify. The housing, that's going to be tough, but at the same time, it's certainly not insurmountable. But again, I'm probably stating the obvious, but I think this is, you got a lot of opportunity there in this subcommittee to have a lot of things that I think we're going to find a lot of common ground on. So good work. Anyone have a question for Professor Phillips? Okay. That leads us to the final subcommittee, the Race and Criminal Justice System Subcommittee. I'll take the lead on this since I took the lead on the first meeting of that subcommittee, and then Professor Phillips, or Francis, or anyone else who was a part of that can jump on. But we had our first meeting last week. I agreed to be the call it interim chairman of that subcommittee, simply because we're trying to stand up the subcommittee right now. The primary discussion had to do with who would be a member of that subcommittee, and several names were discussed, and more to the point, several entities who needed to be represented were identified, and then efforts have been made since then to reach out to those entities to see who they would want to be on the subcommittee. I'll get with Jordan and get another date set. But in terms of, there wasn't a lot of substance in terms of what exactly we want to see happen, as much as here's who we think needs to be represented on the committee. And then we'll have another meeting, get as many people on that are willing to take part as possible, at which point we will start to identify an agenda and have more details to provide at the next commission meeting. But that's a review, at least, of what took place in the newly formed Race and the Criminal Justice System Subcommittee. Anyone who was a part of that have anything else to add to that recitation? Okay. Well, we were going to take a break but we're quite a bit ahead of schedule here. Kind of, I think, a function of the Zoom meetings. Things go a little quicker because it's tougher to everybody to speak informally like we would in person. But rather than taking a break, since we're about an hour ahead of schedule, why don't we go ahead and plow on into discussion and goals for the December 2020 final report. As has been the case since this commission began, it seems to me that the heavy work is being done in the subcommittees and the various working groups of each subcommittee. Just because it's fresh in my mind, Professor Phillips' discussion moments ago about the Reentry Subcommittee and the very specific things they've identified for the collateral consequences and the housing issues and employment issues and whatnot. I mean, those strike me as very identifiable goals, some short-term, some longer-term. Chief Ackerman's group doing the same thing. Let's identify 10 to 15 things that can be changed right, in the very next session, but maybe in longer term, talk about what more systemic changes need to take place, if any, to the grid system. So any other discussion in terms of what we need? And I guess I'll pose the question to the various subcommittees. Are you getting what you need at this point to, granted, it's already July, so August, September, October, we got about 3 more months worth of meetings, and then sometime in maybe toward the end of that October meeting and all of the November meeting, I think we're going to be hashing out what this final report is going to look like. It's going to go to the legislature. So is everyone getting access to the information? Is there anything you need that you're not getting to be in a position to make those kind of, or to identify those kind of long and short-term issues?
This is Todd Ackerman, proportionality. I think we'll have everything we need, especially for the short term. It was a continuation of what was left from this spring. So that's going to be fairly easy. And then the long-term stuff we'll have, I think we'll do fine with our proportionality with what we have.
Very good. Representative Owens, anything with respect to your, I know you're getting ready to meet more with Patrick and his folks, but
the Representative Owens, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think that one of the things we're going to run up against is the legislative post audit is more than likely not going to have their work done in time to assist us in our work for this final report. So my hope is that this is more of a secondary interim report than it is an actual final report, which is what we're hoping for. In the meantime, I'm confident that as a group, we've got a number of additional people we're adding that we'll be able to put together some great recommendations for the upcoming legislative session. And I will reiterate, as I have for 2 years in a row, I know that the legislature has a heavy appetite for working on mental health and substance abuse related items. So we'll have some things together.
One point of clarification, Representative Owens, you mentioned, I think all of us have mentioned it, just for someone who may be new to listening to us. We're talking about going beyond December. What we have asked, or what we have discussed since, I think, probably April maybe of this year, is the fact that we've all recognized that with COVID and the impact it had on the 2020 legislative session and the inability of the legislators to pass really any of our recommendations, that our initial charge from the legislature was to give an interim initial report in December of 19 and a final report in December of 2020, at which point this commission would cease to exist. And what we've all said is we're going to ask the legislature for one more year so that we can see this through. I believe, and I think I'm right on this, but I'll defer to you or Representative Finney and Senator Haley, the 3 legislators who I know are on this call. I don't believe there's a way to fast track that. I think we have to get it back to that legislature. I mean, there's legislative races taking place in November. We don't even know who all the members of the legislature are until mid-November. But I don't know of a way to know whether or not this commission will be granted a 1-year extension until the legislature is in session in January of 2021. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, I believe you are correct. I know we even kind of tried to take a swing at doing something during the special session, but leadership just wasn't going to work anything other than the one bill. So I think it does have to go back before the legislature. But I know for myself, and I'm sure for Representative Finney and Senator Haley, our intention is to make sure that the items that were introduced last year are reintroduced, that they're pushed through the process. And hopefully, not only can we take care of those things, but then possibly add on to the one bill that we had introduced that would have added a public defender and do a couple other things to extend that time. So I believe that you're correct.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that to reiterate that for all of us, I think we are hopeful, and it seems very much commonsensical that this commission, especially in this environment, in the post-Floyd environment we're living in right at the moment, for the legislature to want to shut down a criminal justice reform commission without its work being seen, fall all the way through. I don't really see that. I think our legislators want to finish, but as we proceed, we need to keep in mind that the report due December 1st of this year, 2020, is the only thing we have control over, and this may be it. And if it is, then we need to make sure that it's, and I'm saying this for all the subcommittees and all of us, that our proposals have that in mind, that we hope that we have another year, but make sure you write it in such a fashion that it's clear that that may not be the case. So anyway, stating the obvious, perhaps, I thought it was a good time to reiterate.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Owen.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman.
Yeah. Go ahead. Who's that? Shelley?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelley Williams. Do we know that whether or not CSG would still be able to come alongside us if we were to get that extension? And if we don't know that yet, is there a process that needs to be started? Because just speaking from the Supervision Committee, without CSG's assistance, we really wouldn't be where we are today. And so I just want to make sure that there's a mechanism in place for ensuring they come alongside of us if it is extended for one additional year.
I will say that I know there's a mechanism, but before I shoot from the hip, Patrick, are you still on the call? If so, I'll give you the floor for a moment to explain that process if you can.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were going to say, Chairman Bennett, so feel free to correct me if I speak out of turn. But from our organizational standpoint, the challenge is exactly as it's been laid out. It's hard for the funders to approve extended time without knowing if it will be extended, and they won't know if you're going to be extended until the legislature approves that either in January or February, and that's when they would be able to make a call on that. So we're working under the assumption, just like Chairman Bennett described, that they may get an extension, but if not, we're doing everything we can so that in December we're putting our best foot forward so that if nothing happens, we put our best foot forward. Now, that being said, what we can do is if there's some way to determine, I don't know if that's with leadership or with key members of the legislature, if we can tell funders that there are some limitations with knowing for sure the dates, but from what we're hearing is there might be an extension. They may be able to extend that they may be able to extend our time further, but they'd also want to know from you all what that means, because from January to March, April of next year, presumably you guys will be in the legislative session, and you might need our support with testimony and helping to move whatever bills forward that you are going forward with. And that's separate from doing analysis and assessment and policy development work. And we need clarity from you all on what the ask is so that we can say, funders, here's what the ask is. Either it's legislative support or it's legislative support and assessment support. And that doesn't sound, you guys can answer that now because it's out of your control, what you might need coming this time next year. But I'll pause and see what Chairman Bennett, this is the first time I'm saying this out loud, so might have a different reaction.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I would say, I don't speak for the commission if it requires a vote, but I don't know that it does. I'll just state what strikes me as fairly obvious, and that is, assuming the worst, assuming this is it, December of 2020, we still have a final report to issue. As you said, we're going to put our best foot forward. And then what comes with that is implicitly work on behalf of this commission, probably me as the chair, and then other members to come up and give testimony during the next legislative session. And so even if the commission ceases to exist, it's understood, I believe, that various members of probably subcommittees and working groups and myself as the chair would come before the legislature and introduce bills and then give testimony about the package that we're proposing. And insofar as CSG can offer technical support in that endeavor, yeah, I think I'll open it up for discussion, but I think we would love to have have someone there to offer testimony in front of the various legislative subcommittees that would hear these, Senate Judiciary or House Judiciary, House Corrections, whatever it may be. So there's that. As far as the second component of what you said is, and that's following through with us for one more year in terms of resource for this commission. Yeah, we won't know until we know, but I think one thing we can do is rely on our legislators who are part of this commission, Representative Finney, Representative Owens, Senator Wilburn, and Senator Haley, to get with leadership of the various, both houses of the legislature, even in December, January, and make sure they understand this, what we're asking for, and try to, see what kind of reception we get. If it's, if they've sort of primed the pump and we understand we're going to get a warm reception, could I even get that introduced very early in the session and approved in that first week or two, so we would know earlier rather than later. Sticking around till turnaround or that makes it much more difficult later in the session. You're fighting for people's attention and for time. This strikes me as a pretty simple ask, thumbs up or down. Are we going to keep going or not? So that's my more than probably 5 cents worth here. So anyone have anything to add?
If I could, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. This is Haley, Senator Haley again. First, full disclosure, there's no guarantee that I'm coming back at all. I have a vigorous campaign this year for re-election, so I don't want to be presumptive in any way, shape, or form. I think Representative Owens is home free, and I think Senator Wilburn is too, so they both can presume that. I certainly have to struggle and to come back in January. Should I come back, I want to say I've never seen a larger commitment by the legislature. I don't know if Representative Finney or Representative Owens want to speak, but they approved more days for the interim for this committee than I've ever seen. I mean, I don't know if it was a typo or whatever, but I think it says something like double-digit number of days for this. And maybe it's a typo, but that kind of commitment is unprecedented for support for an interim committee. I thought it said 16 days. And so, I mean, I've never seen that from the LCC. So I think there's strong legislative support for what the work of this commission is doing and its continuation well into the next year, and not including, I want to say that not only for CSG's sake, but for those of us that are laboring in the vineyard with it right now. So I think you'll find the commitment will be ongoing from the current and future legislature to support the mission that we've undertaken.
Very good. Any other comments about, with regard to Shelley's question about CSG or my earlier question, just in terms of the various subcommittees and what they may need moving forward to put us in the best position to finalize our December 2020 final report?
I think, Mr. Chair, I think Representative Finney, were you trying to be recognized? I thought I saw, so sometimes they don't, I mean, I think Representative Finney was trying to, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Gail, if I missed you, go ahead.
Apologize for that. I'm still learning this Zoom thing. I kept trying to raise my hand over there, but no, I just wanted to comment about, I would be very surprised if the legislature didn't continue our committee, because I think that this information that we're providing and that we're working on is just so invaluable for the legislature. So just want to add that. And I was pretty surprised at the number of days too, because I'm usually used to seeing 2-3 days maximum. So that is just really a good sign that this is going to be a continuation. And I would encourage us to continue doing what we're doing, and even work. I would recommend that we continue working on legislation too, because this is the time we need to be ready to be able to submit it. And hopefully I'll be back too. I have a tough race too. Anytime you have a race is a tough race in my opinion. So, but I plan on coming back. So David, you'll probably be back too. Anyway, that's all I want to say.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Yes.
And this is Spence Cohen. Just thinking about these dates, and I guess I'm thinking specifically for my subcommittee, since I've got a lot of different working groups, thinking about timelines. If we need to have the full report ready, when would you like to see from each group our own group report submitted to the commission so that we can get this whole report put together?
Well, everybody's collective memory may be better than mine, but my memory is that we had it submitted at least before the November meeting of last year, so that we could discuss, pretty vigorously. We spent several hours that November meeting finalizing what the report would look like. And then the good folks, Jordan and Natalie and the rest of them, all made it look a lot better than I would have if I had been the one typing it up. So, obviously the sooner the better, at least, even if it's rough drafts, even if it's a working copy, something that we can circulate so that we know we can start to identify an agenda for discussion. And if it turns out that, ideally I'd like to know at least where we're headed by maybe a week before the October meeting. So the last week of September. That's very ambitious, I understand. But if we have in terms of short-term goals, it's going to be fairly simple. Many of them are just repeats from last year since so very little got passed. Okay, we'll repeat that. But we're going to also have some other short-term goals. I mean, I'm just thinking of the collateral consequences information that Professor Phillips was mentioning earlier. That's a short-term goal. I mean, those need to be corrected in the next session. This is not, a 5-year lookout. What I'm getting at though is this do we need to set up is a single 3-hour meeting in November going to be sufficient to address all of the things that we're looking at? And the sooner we know the scope of what we're looking at, the sooner I can assess that, because, maybe we want to try to do short-term goals in October, long-term goals in November. I don't know. I'm just trying to make sure we have saved ourselves enough time to have the kind of robust discussion I know we're going to want before we submit a final report to the legislature. So I'm not going to pin anybody down and say, by God, I have to have it by the 28th of September. But the sooner we could get at least an idea of where we're headed, the sooner then I can set agendas and make good use of the final month and a half of this commission. That helps?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Sheriff Carr.
Yes, sir.
Would it be too much to ask for just like an outline from each working group or subcommittee by the end of September, 1st of October, just for the full commission to review?
I don't think it's too much to ask, at least for, like I said, a working copy of a rough draft. I'd say if you're going to do it, might as well have it by the end of September, because we typically meet by that second week of the month. So if it's the first week of October, last week of September, somewhere in there, yes, I think that would be it.
I know the work, as you mentioned, that we put on Jordan and his staff and Robert, and it's kind of cumbersome on them to pull this together in a full document.
Yep.
Thank you.
Have any thoughts? Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
Bob Gallimore, Legislative Research. I was just going to say, we can sit down with you here within the next few days and work out the timeline backwards from our end, so that we know kind of the technical deadlines that we need to have. And then that can help inform when the subcommittees are getting the information in, and your meeting planning as well.
Very good. And also we can divvy up that, I think it's 16 is the number of meetings we've been approved. So we can divvy those up, make sure we are using those effectively for everybody. So I'll get with Bob and Jordan and Natalie, whoever needs to be a part of that call here in the next week or so. And we will submit or send out an email to everybody, kind of giving a time frame for the rest of the work of this commission. That work? Okay. Any other thoughts, comments about the discussion of the goals for December for the December 2020 final report to the legislature?
Chairman Bennett, this is Jean Phillips
Yes,
from KU. I have a clarification question. So when you say 16, that's 16 for the commission and all the subcommittees? So will we know how many each subcommittee is going to get? Or am I missing that?
Suggesting to Bob, we get together and make sure we divvy it out. I mean, for instance, the data management subcommittee probably doesn't need to meet again until there's a something back from post audit. So let's make sure that everybody's getting the full use of those. I'd hate to finish in December and realize we still had 5 meetings we could have utilized. So I'll get with Bob and those guys and get that disseminated.
What about individual working groups? So like if Representative Finney and I are working with Council of State Governments on housing issues, do those count as well, or is it just our subcommittee meetings?
I'll double check, but I believe it's just the subcommittee meetings. The working group meets with with Patrick and those guys. I don't think that counts as one. So.
Great.
Mr. Chairman, if you'd like, I can clarify a little bit right now.
Yes.
That would be helpful.
Yes.
So the authorization by the LCC for the subcommittee meeting days, I believe the ask was for 2 for each subcommittee. Those are for meetings that would utilize the State House or utilize the legislative Zoom account. So from last year, if you may remember, before the COVID situation, each subcommittee had been authorized to do 2 State House meetings because the thought was there may be a desire to have some hearings at the State House by the various subcommittees. So rolling that forward this year, I believe the ask again was for 2 of those State House meetings in case the situation becomes where a subcommittee does want to have a State House meeting, or if a subcommittee wants to use the legislative Zoom account. I know a lot of subcommittees, the chairpersons have been arranging for their own Zoom usage. And as long as that occurs, the number of meetings is unlimited. The meeting numbers really only come into when there's going to be logistics used from the legislature.
If some subcommittee wants to say, Professor Phillips says, I don't mind using my Zoom account, we'll do that so we can have more meetings. There's still got to be the coma portion of this in terms of giving notice. Can she send that to you all to put note just to make sure notice is effectively given, or is that something the subcommittees have to take on themselves?
Right. The process that's been, sorry, Bob Gallimore, Legislative Research again. The process that's been being used over this past year where chairs provide the information to Jordan, who then sends it to this distribution list, that will continue. If a subcommittee forms multiple working groups, I believe the practice has been for the subcommittee to handle the working group notifications themselves. So we take care of the notifications at the subcommittee level, but then if the subcommittee sets up additional subgroups of that subcommittee, you kind of handle that in-house.
And if you just say at a meeting, trying to make sure so it's getting a little granular here, but if we're having a subcommittee and we say we want to have a working group meet next week on the Zoom account, is saying that during the already noticed up subcommittee a sufficient notice, or do we have to send out additional notice that the working group is going to be meeting next Thursday on Zoom?
I would, Bob Gallimore, again, I would defer to the revisers for the exact requirements. I believe the best practice is to have a notification list that you maintain for those working group notifications and to send that out, I think usually via email with any relevant links or documents.
Makes sense. Yeah. All right. Okay. I think we've at least covered that. Does that, Professor Phillips and others, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's how I, this is Jean Phillips, I'm sorry. That's how I've been doing it, is I use my own Zoom account, I send it to Jordan, and then he posts it. And so as long as I can keep doing that and that doesn't count in the 16, then I'm good.
Very good. Good question. That helps. Anything else from anyone else on the commission? All right. Well, we will, I think our next, we'll just stay on the same schedule unless that causes a problem for anybody. I don't think there's any, I think to look at my calendar ahead of time, but second week of August should not be 10th. I think would be the next scheduled, if we stick to the plan here, I think would be the next scheduled meeting. And we will have, I'll get Jordan to send out a meeting notification to everybody, and we will continue to work. Anything else before we shut this down? I don't think so. All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn the meeting, and we'll see everybody again next month. And well, sounds like we're making good progress and should have quite a bit of information for an update. I guess I'll state one final thing, and that is at some point, if the COVID situation changes, maybe we'll have the ability to all sit in a room together again sometime soon. But at least for the short term, we'll continue to social distance, and you know, it's a little cumbersome, but we're still continuing to get work done. I will say that Zoom meetings are a far sight better than trying to get all this done on a conference call on a phone, just a faceless phone call. So I do appreciate the good folks at Zoom for making this work for us. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time. We will see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Take care.